So Housing Opportunities Made Equal has been around for a while. We were founded in the 1970s to fight housing discrimination in Richmond City specifically. And that's probably what we're still most known for is our fair housing investigation and enforcement work. So trying to dismantle all forms of housing discrimination and defending people's right to housing under Virginia law and federal law. But in that time, we've also expanded a lot in what we do and the geographic area we serve. So we are a statewide organization.
Okay.
So anybody anywhere in the state can report, can file a complaint with us if they feel they've been discriminated against in their housing, and we will investigate. But we also offer a number of other services that in some cases are a little bit more geographically specific. So for example, we have a Move to Opportunity program where we help people with housing vouchers, which is the federal rent assistance, find housing in the community of their choice. It's illegal to discriminate against people based on their source of income for their housing, but we still see it happen all the time, and it can be really difficult for people with vouchers to find somewhere to live. We also offer, we administer down payment assistance programs for a number of different localities and programs. We work very closely with a lot of other affordable housing nonprofits to sort of connect different kinds of assistance together, from down payment assistance to just having the home being affordable, as well as doing homeownership counseling.
What specific role do you serve right now, or what does your day-to-day function look like here?
So I'm on the policy team. So Home has traditionally worked mostly at the state level to advance not only tenants' rights, but fair housing law in general, and had some really big wins in the past 10 years of actually expanding Virginia fair housing law to add protections that are actually not in federal fair housing law. So Virginia actually has better, stronger protections for people's right to housing than federal law does.
Okay.
There are certain additional protected categories like gender and sexual identity, and source of funds. That's a Virginia law protection. But we have also expanded into advocacy in lots of other areas affecting housing. So we advocate for increased public investment in affordable housing. We advocate for increased tenant protections. And very recently, we've gotten more involved in land use regulation, so making it easier to build more affordable kinds of housing in more places.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so I wanted to touch base on the eviction data because I was reading it on your guys' website, and there was a lot of good, I think, eye-opening data on there. So I think it would be important to point out Virginia's eviction rates are double the national average. So I was reading on there in 2018, Virginia's eviction rate was 14.9%, while the national average was 7.7%. And on a daily average, there's 466 eviction filings on an average day in Virginia, which is pretty crazy.
Yeah.
And then another thing I thought was interesting that I wanted to get your thoughts on was there was this graph on there. It was labeled unlawful detainers in Virginia. And it was basically a graph with a time frame from April 2018 to April of 2023. And it was a U-shaped graph.
Yeah.
And what you see is like the bottom of that U curve, that's when COVID was.
Yep.
And I mean, we know that one of the reasons that there was such a decrease in evictions during COVID was because the federal government essentially put out like a eviction moratorium. But Virginia also did something else that I don't think a lot of people talked about. They adopted a temporary budget provision during the pandemic that required landlords to pursue rental assistance.
Yep.
Yeah, so before they could do that, they had a 14-day time period to, if the tenant already, they hadn't already applied, they would have to apply for rental assistance on the tenant's behalf. And like Virginia, that's one of the biggest reasons I think that they saw such a decrease in eviction rates. Do you think that that's a policy or provision that in theory should or could be enacted permanently?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're calling out something really important, which is that there was a coordinated and concerted effort to provide assistance to tenants during the pandemic, and that's why we saw evictions drop. And that came in the form of policy, right? Like the eviction moratorium you described from the CDC, which was not actually a universal ban on evictions, but it did give a lot of people more time and some protection from being evicted if they knew to enforce that ban, because it did rely on tenants to to basically show up in court and say, hey, my landlord shouldn't be evicting me right now, judge. And the rental assistance piece is extremely important. Not only did they require that the landlord pursue rental assistance, but they also offered rental assistance, right? Like that is extremely crucial. There was a pretty unprecedented investment in providing rent and mortgage assistance to people during the pandemic. And from my work on the time on an eviction helpline, we really were focused on sort of like these two nexes of people when they're in crisis and about to lose their housing. One of which is the legal action that's being taken against them, and the other, which is the root issue, which is the fact that they're behind on their rent. And pairing the legal assistance with the funding, right? Helping people access that funding.
Yep.
Because, the funding was amazing and unprecedented, as I said, but it was also, for many people, difficult to access. The portal was confusing. Sometimes the approvals were really delayed. So it really took all of these things working together, I think, to result in the drop of evictions that we saw during the pandemic.
Yeah. How, I guess, easy would you say is it for the average renter to navigate the court system when they're going through like an eviction lawsuit?
Not easy.
Yeah.
Yeah, not easy. I mean, I think the law is really not designed to be easily understood by lay people. I think it's actually intentionally designed for the opposite, to be to only be, navigable with the help of an attorney.
Yeah.
Right? Because the law is written by attorneys.
Yeah.
And I think also the other thing that's important to understand is that there's an inherent power imbalance when tenants are sued by their landlords, right? Their landlord owns the housing.
Yes.
So that's an imbalance right there. And then also landlords just in general tend to be better resourced than tenants,
Yes.
right? They have more money. Especially larger landlords have attorneys that they basically have on retainer to file these eviction cases for them. And those attorneys more often than not have relationships with judges, right? When they show up in court, the judge knows them, they have a rapport, and very often when the tenant does show up for that eviction hearing, which most tenants don't, when the tenant does show up for that eviction hearing, it's like a proceeding in a foreign language, right? There's a conversation that's happening between the landlord and the judge, and it is very hard to know how to intercede effectively.
Yeah.
So no, it's really not. Yeah. It's really very difficult for tenants to advocate for themselves in eviction proceedings. I mean, I want to be really clear. Many tenants do, right, and do effectively. But I think the system is really not designed to make it easier, make it possible for them.
Yeah, and also thinking about like having to do that stuff that you're completely unfamiliar with, like in your day-to-day schedule when you've got a job and a family too. There was another stat on I was reading. It says families, they get hit the hardest. This is a national statistic, but nationally, households with children under 18 are 2 times more likely to be evicted than households without children.
Yeah.
And it completely disrupts your life. Like it affects your access to jobs, healthcare, schools. And then I don't think people talk about like the emotional toll that happens when you're, evicted from your home.
The stress is incredible. I mean, just the stress of being at risk of losing your housing. I think if you haven't experienced that, I think it's really difficult to comprehend the physical toll that it takes, not just on your mental health, but your physical health, right? Like I think there's actually also been some really great studies looking at the health impacts of eviction and of displacement. So this isn't just something that makes somebody's life hard for a little while. This can actually impact your health in the long term. And there are so many, I mean, you mentioned like, the fact of court hearings usually happen on weekdays in the mornings for eviction, especially in Richmond City. And so most people work during that time. So in order to even show up to court to advocate for yourself, people often have to take off work. And if they're already behind on their rent, that means that they're losing out on money in order to go and defend themselves, often in a situation where if they just had a little bit more time, they'd be able to, catch up and avoid eviction in the first place. But then, so it's really sort of this like snowballing effect. Also, I mean, I think the law is now hopefully changing around this issue, but many courts are extremely unfriendly to tenants, also just in the way that the courts run and the like various policies that they implement. So, for example, Richmond City General District Court does not allow people to bring their phones in.
Okay.
And where do most people keep their documents and evidence, right? Photos, videos, It's always on their phone. And many people don't realize that that's the case until they show up to court. And then there's nowhere to put their phone.
Right.
You know, I mean, there's many other things I could go on about. Like, they don't allow e-filing. Like, the courts are just really not, in many ways, they're sort of...
it's not easy to navigate for...
No, it's not. And they're not up to date on technology. Like, you know, you can't easily, like, check things online or submit things online. It's just really not designed to be user-friendly, if you will.
And I want to point out that the majority of evictions are for unpaid rent, not, you know, anything. And that's not at all shocking when you see how cost burdened the average renter in Richmond is. Do you think it would be beneficial for Virginia to adopt any kind of rent control policy, such as the ones that, like, I know New York has a rent control policy, something similar to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that Home, along with other members of our statewide Tenants' Rights Coalition, have been advocating for years, is the ability for localities to adopt anti-rent gouging ordinances. In particular, what we see is that older properties often, right, because most of the time older properties are the ones that are more affordable to people, those properties often get bought up by larger companies, right, whether that's private equity or, you know, some other type of, like, institutional investor. They get bought up by some corporation, and then they try to just squeeze as much money out of people as they can, because they know they have nowhere else to go.
And those houses, or you know, whether it's an apartment or condo or house, they usually have code violations.
Yes.
I mean, they're...
Yes, it's this combination of disinvestment, so they're not reinvesting money in the property while also increasing people's cost burden by raising the rent or charging junk fees. And that's the business model, right? So yeah, I think absolutely being able to put some kind of reasonable limitation on how much landlords can raise the rent is extremely important to give people long-term stability in their neighborhoods. But I think that also has to be paired with meaningful increases in the amount of housing that's available, right? Because in effect, again, like, this predatory business model works because there is a shortage of housing, and because we haven't been building enough multifamily housing to keep up with population growth. And that's true pretty much across the United States. That's part of the reason why costs have gone up as much as they have. Because ultimately, if we don't build that new housing, you know, at the end of the day, even if somebody's rent is stabilized, that can still have negative consequences for the affordability of housing as a whole. So
it's ultimately a supply and demand issue. So
yeah, exactly. But the thing that we always say, it's like these things all have to work together, right? Like, there's no one solution to the housing crisis. It's going to take many different tools and solutions, and it requires also, you know, I mean, there are so many things about our housing system and, like, the housing market that are inequitable and capitalistic and unfair to working people and to tenants. And it is extremely important that we work on solutions that help shift that reality away, right? Shifting away as much as we can from housing being a commodity. But also at the same time, like, we live in the economic reality that we do. And so there are some solutions that we're going to need to implement that recognize that reality and that sort of work within the bounds of the system we have.
Yeah, for sure. And I also want to point out how the eviction timeline in Virginia seems pretty fast compared to other places.
Yeah.
Now, recently, the Virginia General Assembly, they actually amended the pay or quit notice due date. So it used to be 5 days if someone hadn't paid their rent that the landlord had to issue that. Now it's 14 days, which is good. But if it's not received by that 14th day, then the landlord can file for an eviction. And then you don't talk about the late fees that gets charged. Now, they're capped at 10% of either the amount due or 1 month's rent, whichever is less. But still, like, for someone that's cost burden trying to get caught up, you're adding additional fees. So that person, you know, gets their paycheck and it clears, and they can only put that amount towards the rent or whatever is left over, but then they have to factor in the fees. Then it's like there's no way to get caught up.
Oh yeah, yeah. And then on top of that, there's also attorney fees, right? When a case gets filed in court, the landlord can charge the tenant attorney's fees, and then the tenant is responsible for paying those fees if they lose the case. And there's a number of landlords in Richmond City that work with this particularly predatory landlord attorney firm that has a practice of, they basically put it in people's lease that they are responsible for paying attorney's fees of 25% of the amount that they owe. right? And these particular complexes, what we often see is that they file serial eviction cases. So if somebody's behind on August rent, they'll file an eviction case. And then if they're still behind in September, they'll file a second case instead of amending the case that may already exist.
You're just double
from
hitting
August.
them. Yeah.
And it's a way, I mean, I think that it's a way of basically squeezing more money out of people, right? Because then you can charge them twice as much court costs, twice as much attorney's fees. And those are costs that can really snowball and make it impossible for people to catch up.
Yeah. Well, with all that said, what are some examples of real practical policies that you think we could enact to further protect tenants in Richmond?
Oh man, so many things. I mean, one thing that you mentioned earlier about, the pandemic and sort of the policy of requiring landlords to offer rental assistance. I think, something similar to that, like pairing rental assistance with a requirement that landlords use that rental assistance, that could be something that's really helpful. Something that's kind of approaching something similar that did pass the General Assembly this year, it doesn't go into effect until next year, is a requirement that landlords, I think like larger landlords that have more than 4 units should offer people a payment plan when they fall behind on their rent before they can file in court to evict them. So I think that's a really important reform. Also, there were so many great tenant protections that got passed this year, including some additional protections against retaliation for tenants. Because of course, raising the rent in retaliation for the tenant making a code complaint or something like that, it's really, really difficult for a tenant to prove that the landlord retaliated on the way that the law is written right now.
Right.
So addressing that is really important.
Do we see a lot of that, or do you see a lot of that, like landlord retaliation?
That is a great question for our housing investigation team. But I can say anecdotally from what I have heard, there are many tenants who think that their landlord is retaliating against them for, various things, for complaining about conditions, to trying to organize, to talking to the media. The problem is that it is very difficult to prove in front of the court right now because the burden of proof is on the tenant.
Well, like I'm in particular trying to focus on the river lofts at Tobacco Row and highlight some of the issues there, because I find the river lofts at Tobacco Row interesting because they definitely market themselves to be like this kind of like higher end, like meant for young professionals in Richmond.
Yeah.
But you move in and you still deal with the same crap that anyone else has to deal with.
Yeah.
But funny enough, like a lot of the people that reached out to me, the tenants there, they were willing to go on camera, but only if I blurred their face, because they're fear of getting,
getting sued or getting evicted or
from a huge real estate investment company. Because West Shore owns the river lofts, and they've got like thousands of other rental units across the East Coast. So it's very telling that most people are want to protect their privacy in that way.
Yeah, and I think that they're right to be scared, because Virginia law really provides. I think earlier you were saying like, how does Virginia law compare to other states when it comes to tenant rights? The answer is Virginia is probably one of the most landlord-friendly states, and that's part of the reason why our eviction rate is as high as it is. Under Virginia law, landlords don't need to have a reason if they want to non-renew somebody's lease. So essentially, the landlord has ultimate power over whether or not somebody gets to stay in their home long term, even if that person hasn't done anything wrong and they've been a good tenant. There's a pretty deep power imbalance, and eviction is pretty quick and pretty cheap for landlords. And ultimately, tenants don't really have a whole lot of recourse if at the end of the day, their landlord is just like, I just don't want to renew your lease. You're just completely out of luck.
What is your biggest piece of advice for someone maybe going through a situation where they're trying to have to navigate the court system, or they're being hit with a pay or quit notice? Like, what do you recommend is like their first step that they should take?
The first step is to read up on your rights. So there's a number of good resources in Virginia for tenants. One that I was lucky enough to work on while I was at the Virginia Poverty Law Center is called the Eviction Defense Center, which is a pretty comprehensive online resource for tenants who are facing eviction and who might not be able to access an attorney. So that's a really good place to go and read up on your basic rights. Things like, how much can a late fee be? Like, how much can my landlord charge me for a late fee? Or how long is the eviction process? Or if this particular thing happened to me in my housing, like, is that a defense if I'm being evicted? So that's a really great place to go. Tenants should also reach out to their local legal aid office. Virginia has a really great network of legal aid organizations that provide free legal assistance in civil matters to people, which eviction is a civil matter, right? That's in civil court and not criminal. They often, have a real strain on their resources because there's always more people than they can help, but they're a great resource if you income qualify. So definitely check out who your local legal aid is. That's also information that you can find on the Eviction Defense Center.
Okay.
And beyond that, I would say get organized, right? Like, obviously, when you're in crisis, often the only thing you can focus on is getting through that crisis. But if you can talk to your neighbors and understand whether this is something that's happening to everyone, there's strength in numbers, there's power in numbers. There's been really great examples of tenant unions in other cities making real wins against their landlords and doing incredible work to remove housing from the speculative market and bringing it into tenant ownership. I think those are things that we can learn from. But the first step is getting organized, getting to know your neighbors, and working together to deal with the issues that you're all collectively facing.
Yes, I also agree that getting together as a community helps, because the more isolated we are, no one knows what the heck is going around.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, well, thank you for answering all those questions.
Yeah,
and
happy to
letting me
do it.
know. All right.
Happy to do it. Thank you so much.
Okay.